Hello, Kat Salois, Director of Research at the McGregor Company. McGregor's is a family-owned, independent egg retailer with more than 70 years' experience in the crop input space. We have 35 brick and mortars employing more than 350 people across eastern Washington, northern Idaho, and northeast Oregon. All in, the Pacific Northwest will plant right at 4.3 million acres of wheat annually. Of this, 75% is winter wheat, while only 25% is spring wheat. It is likely that you've heard of the pest of wireworm and how it affects spring wheat. However, did you know this pest can and does affect winter wheat? Its effects can be quite severe, although the damage can be hard to recognize, thus causing hidden yield loss. In today's video, we're going to dive into observations from the field to help you become better at scouting for damage and determining if wireworm is a problem for you in your winter wheat. So really the first question is, what are wireworms? Well, wireworms are click beetle larvae. Adult click beetles start emerging in our region in April, and we can get a fall emergence if weather and temperature are right. Those adults will lay eggs, hundreds of them, that become larvae. The kicker is those larvae are very hardy, and they can persist in the soil for 2 to 10 years. McGregor started doing research on the pest that is wireworm in the Pacific Northwest about 25 years ago as cruiser, thiamethoxam, and imidacloprid were first entering the market. Up until this point, the preferred seed-applied insecticide was lindane, and this was pretty convenient because lindane showed mortality behavior on wireworms. However, it became under heavy scrutiny from the EPA and was ultimately banned in 2006. When we started doing research with lindane next to the neonic insecticides such as thiamethoxam and imidacloprid, we learned a few things that were really important. Lindane actually had a pretty significant yield drag outside the presence of wireworm. So outside the presence of wireworm, it was not beneficial to yield. The neonicotinoid insecticides, like cruiser and imidacloprid, they actually had pretty good behavior on wireworm and were yield positive outside the presence of that pest. So they really became the preferred choice. However, when you think about how that affects the resident population, lindane was controlling the resident population, the neonics were not. When we think about which crops wireworms affect across the Pacific Northwest, spring wheat, winter wheat, barley, are pulse crops as in lentils, chickpeas, and spring peas. I think they're most prevalent in lentils and spring wheat. When we think about the areas where wireworm are the most severe, they typically are really heavy following CRP or any kind of perennial forage or grass like alfalfa. We will also see heavy populations in direct or no-till systems that have a thick organic matter layer on the soil surface. Wireworm like soil moisture, so you will find them heavier in sub-irrigated flats in those unique topography areas that hold water in the PNW. Wireworm do not lack soil compaction. So if you notice that the crop is growing better in a tire track than outside of it, that is a pretty telltale sign that you have a wireworm issue. These pests prefer ground temperatures between 50 and 65 degrees, and they will dive deep into that soil profile, really anywhere above 75 to 80 degrees. Wireworm prefer to feed in the top 3 inches of that soil surface. They eat seeds, prune roots, chew stems, kill tillers, and that damage can be 100% yield loss. I will say, I think it's really important that when we think about the effects of wireworm to also think about our yield limiting factors and our yield components. And the reason is when we try to determine if that pest is actually a yield limiting factor in winter wheat, we need to understand which yield component we are affecting. So yield components in the crops that we are dealing with today, say wheat, those are heads per acre, grains per head, and the weight of each one of those grains. The reason I bring this up is in the Pacific Northwest, let's think about how winter wheat is managed. Winter wheat is typically planted in, let's say, mid-September. We typically get opportunity for that crop to tiller, and we often use starter fertilizers. What this means is that heads per acre is typically not a yield limiting factor in our cropping environments. Wireworm affects heads per acre, they kill tillers. So let's think about scenarios where heads per acre becomes a limiting factor. When we plant late, say mid-October into November, that means that that crop hasn't had time to tiller and could have heads per acre as a limiting factor. In years where we don't have enough moisture or can't plant into soil moisture, and we get late emergence, say mid-October into November, that again doesn't allow that crop time to tiller. In rotations that say contain crops like chickpeas, and we don't harvest until mid-September, so we can't get fertilized in a timely fashion and planted until, let's say, mid-October into late November, that also is a situation where that crop doesn't have time to tiller. That's when wireworm are going to see the most impact or the most damage to yield in those scenarios. Wireworm can be hard to spot in winter wheat fields, and if you've dug into the issue of how to actually go about scouting for them before, you've probably listened to different talks that encourage you to use bait balls. Quite honestly, I've had very little success with this method in a whole field scenario, but once you understand a couple telltale signs, I think you will be much more comfortable at going out and scouting from a whole field basis. Generally, one of the biggest signs out there that wireworm could be a problem is weed control issues. I know that sounds a little bit weird, but when you think about it, the number one cultural practice that we have for weed management is crop competition. When we start losing tillers and losing plants, we lose that crop competition. So what you're looking at in this picture is winter wheat that has been treated for a broadleaf herbicide. I was called out to this field because there was a complaint on the performance of that herbicide. What we found is the root cause of that issue is wireworm taking out a whole lot of that crop and allowing that weed the opportunity to come in, and it looked like a herbicide failure. In this picture, this was original work that we did with seed treatments in lentils. So the green box that you see to the right of that flag has been treated with a seed-applied insecticide, thimethoxam. In the bare areas that you see has no seed-applied insecticide. This was taken 30 days after germination. This was taken 60 days after germination. That white that you see, that's mayweed. That is a non-desirable effect. Inside that box, that was the area treated with the seed-applied insecticide. What you're seeing is that we got weed control inside the areas where there was crop competition, and we did not get weed control where the wireworm took out a majority of the crop. This is a pretty easy thing to think about. It's a numbers game. So when we don't have a crop to compete for that acre, weeds will take over. Now, instead of that herbicide seeing like maybe 5 weeds, that herbicide is seeing 500 weeds. When 500 weeds are presented with that herbicide, odds are high that one will escape. That becomes resistant. Wireworm are a small problem across your acre. They don't migrate all that fast, but when you blow through that one resistant weed with a combine, you now spread that issue to tens of acres and hundreds of acres, and the issue gets big in a hurry. This is a great example from 2021. I was called to this field for 2 issues. The field was treated with 3.25 ounces of Zidua post-plant pre-emergent in the fall. In theory, this was very ideal timing, and we should expect very good weed control. The stand was erratic and spotty, so the grower originally thought that it was herbicide damage. He was also not satisfied with the weed control that he was getting out of that herbicide application. So as we drill down into that a little bit farther, what you're seeing here is one row is not affected, one row is affected. Any area where that crop was stunted, now we have a big weed patch. If we drill in a little bit closer, you can see telltale signs of wireworm. See that dead tiller where it's just one leaf? That is wireworm. What that looks like even closer is you put a shovel in the ground and you can easily find that pest right underneath. He was right there at that soil surface. So that was an erratic stand, what was thought to be herbicide damage, and the root cause was actually wireworm. Another scenario that's pretty easy to find, even at a 55-mile-an-hour scout, is when things just don't look right. So if you look at this water drainage right here, this should be some of the most productive acre across that entire field. But what happened is there was very little crop left. And to me, that just looked really suspicious. Got out of the truck, went and investigated this issue. You know what I found? Wireworm digging in that spot. Wireworm like soil moisture. They will pool any place that they can find soil moisture. And in this scenario, the wheat crop was well into stem elongation, and that wireworm was still trying to take out those plants. The other thing that was interesting is as I turned around and walked back down the hill, started realizing that the entire 20-acre flat below it was also thick with this pest. When you look at how wireworm attack winter wheat a little bit differently than spring wheat, those pests generally feed below ground. If you look closely here, I sat and observed this particular wireworm for a while because what had happened is he'd sit there and sting his way. Those black dots are effects of that wireworm stinging his way all the way up that stem until he found a place he liked and he burrowed right into that stem. I would like to investigate this issue a little bit farther, but what I think is going on is our systemic insecticides like thiamethoxam or imidacloprid, they tend to pool in growing regions of that plant. So they'll be highly concentrated in that crown and leaf tips. I think that pest was sitting there trying to find the right spot that he could dig into, found his entry point, and away he went. In a year like 2020, where yield should have been absolutely determined by grains per head and the size of each one of those grains, losing a few tillers wasn't hugely impactful. In a year like 2021, where it was all about how many tillers we actually kept on that plant, wireworm damage was quite impactful even in our winter wheat crop. So let's get into that last question. What is the true cost of wireworm damage even in our winter wheat crop? This picture is what happens when we have a weed escape and we actually have to go in and kill the crop to get handle of that weed. I think we need to think about the cultural practices and the integrated pest management that wireworm management, even in winter wheat, will bring. If we allow weeds to take hold and develop resistance, that will be a problem that metastasizes itself for years and years to come. Understanding what your yield limiting factors are and how those relate to your yield components is vital when trying to understand if wireworm is an important pest for you to control in your winter wheat. Are you truly getting away with something this year that could be shaving bushels off for years to come? My name's Salois. My contact information is given. Please reach out with any questions you might have.